Question. Dear Kim, can you tell me more about the universal Christ consciousness and the individualized Christ consciousness? What is the difference between them? How come the universal Christ consciousness can't enter this world, but the individualized Christ consciousness can do so? Well, okay, so in my video about how the world was created, I talk more in depth about this. The basic idea is that our Creator, when it decided to create our world of form, decided to create individual extensions of itself and give us free will. And it knew that by giving us free will, we could go into this illusion that we are separate beings. And we could get stuck in that illusion. It could be difficult to get out. So the Creator decided that in order to help us be able to get out of the separate consciousness, no matter how deeply we went into it, it would first create a universal state of consciousness called the Christ consciousness. The universal Christ consciousness. And then everything in the world of form, including us, are created out of that universal Christ consciousness. So we can say it's like a backdrop where everything is created out of. If you want it's a crude illustration, but it's an illustration at least, you can say. Normally in our awareness, we are looking at the world. We are seeing. There's a house, there's a car, there are trees, there are bodies, there are rocks. We are seeing all these kind of things. But all the things we are seeing are made out of atoms. And the atoms are made out of elementary particles that are made out of energy waves. So really you could say, if you could shift your focus away from seeing all these outer things, what would you see? You would see this very intricate pattern of energy waves that are interacting with each other. And you would see that everything is just energy waves. You have a battlefield where there's a dead body that's decaying. And to you, this looks scary and disgusting. But the body is still made out of atoms, and the atoms have no opinion about what they are, that they're making up this body. And deeper level, the energy waves, they're just energy waves. They have no, there's no mental overlay that they're putting on it. So you could say that this corresponds to the universal Christ consciousness. Everything is atoms. And if you could see the levels of the atoms, you would see that this meaning that you are putting on the things that the atoms make up is just all in our minds. And when we connect to the level of the atoms or the energy waves, we can see that the meaning that we assign to it is just really something we assign to it. It isn't the only way. It isn't the highest way. We can actually let it go. So that's one way to describe the Christ consciousness, so that no matter how deeply we go into duality, we can connect to the Christ consciousness. However, the Christ consciousness can't really do anything by itself. It's not meant to. It's not the Christ consciousness creates everything, but everything is created out of it. But how are things created? When a self-aware being that is created out of the Christ consciousness acts upon the Christ consciousness or expresses the Christ consciousness. So in other words, the Creator created the Christ consciousness. It sent self-aware extensions of itself into the first sphere, and they were used their co-creative abilities to build onto the foundation in the first sphere. And they did that by creating everything out of the Christ consciousness. Now, at that point, nobody had gone into duality, but then later in the fourth sphere, as I explained in How the World Was Created, some beings went into duality. And they had the option to connect to the Christ consciousness, but they didn't do it, so they kept going deeper and deeper into separation. So now you have a being who's in separation, and it wants to connect to the Christ consciousness. But it can't connect directly to the universal Christ consciousness. What it can do is it connect to a being at a higher level than itself that has embodied the Christ consciousness. So in other words, we can say a new life stream, a new self-aware being is created with a point-like sense of self. It has a sense it's connected to its I am presence, to the ascended masters that really created it, because we are created out of the beings at a higher level. But the being isn't created. Talk about the 144 levels on Earth, and we are come down to embodiment at the 48th level. This is not the Christ consciousness, personalized, individualized Christ consciousness. So as we seek to expand our sense of connection, we can rise to the 96th level of consciousness, where now we have some degree of personal Christhood. We're not ascended masters, but we have some degree of Christhood. So what I'm saying is that we can either rise towards individualized Christhood, or we can deny it and keep going below it. But when we want to connect to the Christ consciousness outside ourselves, we're not connecting to the universal Christ consciousness, but to a being at a higher level who has individualized the Christ consciousness and therefore become the living Christ. And so you could say, in a certain sense, you could look at Jesus, right? And you can look at one of his profound statements where he said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And in a sense, you could say this wasn't Jesus who personally said, I, Jesus, the only Son of God, am the way, the truth, and the life. No, it was the universal Christ consciousness speaking through him, in the sense that it's the Christ consciousness that is the way, the truth, and the life. But it wasn't the universal Christ consciousness. I think I have probably said this before, that it was the universal Christ consciousness, but it wasn't really. It was an ascended master who was the individualized Christ who spoke through Jesus. And Jesus has actually given teachings that when Jesus talked about his Father, it was the ascended master who was his primary spiritual teacher, which was Lord Maitreya. So, back to the question. The universal Christ consciousness is the backdrop out of which everything is created. But the universal Christ consciousness doesn't express itself in this world. And with this world, I don't just mean the material realm, I mean the spiritual realm beyond it. So you're not really, in a sense, you're not really going to see the universal Christ consciousness until you reach the creator consciousness, the creator level of consciousness. Until you reach that, you're going to see an individualized expression of the Christ consciousness at the level above you. And therefore, it is the individualized Christ consciousness that we use to connect and go beyond the illusions in our own minds. So I hope this makes some kind of sense, but you will probably be able to make more sense of it if you watch my video about how the world was created, so you understand the basic mechanism of the different spheres and what it takes to ascend and so forth. So basically it's this. The universal Christ consciousness is at the level of the atoms, but the atoms can't form things by themselves. They have to be acted upon by a self-aware being. And there are self-aware beings who have individualized the Christ consciousness, become the living Christ, the ascended masters, and then we are in an unascended sphere, so we can work towards becoming the living Christ. But we are not there yet until we, basically we're not fully there until we ascend, but we can be there when we reach the 96th level and go beyond.